have trouble.
There we go. So now on the outbound image, since there's only 3 of you, Brian, you and I are about the same size on the screen.
My head is enormous. That's all I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll sit way back to see if that helps there.
There you go. Yeah, see?
But then I talk like I'm far away.
Now point the other way at the peons beside you there.
I gotta think
No, the other
which
way.
one. Oh,
There you go. Yeah.
those jar heads.
Yeah. Okay, let's see.
Let's tell people this. The size of your head in this show is the size of your biblical knowledge. So I'll just go back.
So I have to go to the other room.
Didn't Jesus say something like the small head will be large and the large head will be small? Or no, wait, that's first and the last.
Yeah. Well, it's effectively it's how you translate the Hebrew, you know.
All right, let's see. We're not going to have Paul with us today, and Bob's not going to be able to make it. And I think Brendan is moved, but he's waiting until I think he finds John just an overly difficult book. And so he's just waiting until we're finally done with it and we move into something like Ezekiel
Romans
or
or
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah.
Revelation.
Maybe it's he finds John an overly difficult host.
Then he would never come back, though.
Yeah. Well, he's getting over it, I guess, right?
Yeah. The intolerable John. Okay. We're going to start in John chapter 19, verse 38. I think when I shared today's live video event, I put verse 28. That was wrong. We start in verse 38 of John chapter 19. And we'll pick up here in a minute with Jesus having died upon the cross, and we're going to start with his burial here in just a few minutes. So if everybody's ready, we'll fade out and we'll be right back. Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome back to another Truth Factor discussion. We have this study every week on Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time, and it is our goal to factor the truth of God's Word into our life and hopefully your life as well. Here in just a few minutes, we're going to be picking up with John chapter 19, verse 38. If you have joined us maybe for the first time and you're watching this through Facebook, you can comment on the live stream there or in the chat area on the YouTube stream. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any thoughts or comments about our study, please feel free to join in. If you would like to contact us outside of this study method here, you can send questions to questions@truthfactor.com or email us individually if you would like, as you see on the screen there, John at Brian at Tom at truthfactor.com. And by the way, these are all aliases, email addresses that forwards on to their own personal email address, but you can definitely contact us through this way. Let's go ahead and bring everyone into the study. And guys, y'all doing well? I realize I forgot 2 things very important, so bear with me here real quick. Brian, how are things going up in your neck of the woods?
We're doing well. This is, I always say this is the best time of year to be in Oregon because you have nice, the summer hasn't got hot yet, so we're still enjoying a little bit of cool and everything's green and, you know, it hasn't dried out yet. In Oregon, it dries out second half of the summer. So this is our optimal time. So if you want to come visit me, this is the moment. Come see me, and then it'll be too hot later.
How about that? How hot does it normally get up there? You know,
It'll get where we're at. It'll get in the 90s. It'll hit 100 for a few days. I mean, it's not like some of these places where it'll be 100 for a month. It'll be 100 for a week at the most.
It's not Oklahoma heat.
No, it's not that. It's also not Oklahoma cold either in the winter. So we kind of avoid both of those.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, we're not nearly as cold as you are in the winter.
I kind of find that hard to believe, but I have to believe you. So
You have to, yeah.
Yeah, that's most of the left coast unless you actually get into the mountains.
Yeah. There's a reason that people that can't handle much weather come out the left coast. So
Yeah.
they're wimps.
There's a reason the cost of living is so high.
Let's not get into that reason, but that's part of it.
This is not a political show. It's
Yeah.
Exactly,
Now is the time when Tom and Brian rant for 30 minutes.
Let's not touch that. So, but
how much is your gas right now, Tom?
The reason they flocked out here was for the environment. I mean, honestly, that when you study the history, that's what brought people out west. Open land, and then the beauty and stuff. You look at national parks. What percentage of national parks are in the western United States?
Well, and the other thing is, we never had a Dust Bowl on the West Coast. In the 30s and 40s, there was never what happened in Oklahoma and Texas and all that. Kansas happened here. The West Coast was always producing agriculture. So that's why all my family that moved to California moved whenever Oklahoma dried up and they had to leave. So.
Oh, I buy that. Yeah. I believe that. Oh, my family's from the East Coast, out in North Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina area. So, all right. Let's see. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into our study. As I said at the introduction there, we're picking up in John chapter 19, verse 38. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome to the study. If you would kind of give us, maybe if you want to, your first name and where you're from. That way we can say hi to you. But you don't have to say anything. But if you do have a thought or comment or question, feel free to share it with us. All right, we're going to pick up, and we have seen Jesus. He has died upon the cross, and his side has been pierced, kind of in a fulfillment of prophecy there. And so now when we start verse 38, we're going to bring in one somewhat new character, and then one that's been around since nearly the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And we'll get into that here in just a moment. Mr. Brian, if you would you mind reading for us? Let's start in verse 38, and let's go ahead and read through verse 42, I believe would be good.
All right, I'll be reading from the New King James Version, John chapter 19, verse 38. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body of Jesus. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. And they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified, there is a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jesus, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby.
All righty. Thank you, Mr. Brian. When we go up to verse 38, we see the person I was talking about, of course, Brian, is Joseph of Arimathea. As being I think this is right, being kind of new, it's not new, but new he's being introduced now. And the other one, of course, is Nicodemus. Now, talk about Joseph of Arimathea for a minute. What's interesting about him the text kind of brings out? Or do you see anything interesting?
Well, it is interesting that all four gospel accounts want to make sure that we know both that this event happened, to fulfill prophecy, we would say, that he would be buried with the rich. But they all point out, this, but they all also identify Joseph of Arimathea by name. I always think that's interesting in that language. And it says in Mark, for example, that Joseph is a prominent council member. So he's a prominent council member. In Matthew, it says he has been a disciple of Jesus for a time. In Luke, it says he's a good and just man. So you get a kind of a three-dimensional image of who this man was, Joseph of Arimathea. But you're right, it is the first time we meet him by name. We haven't bumped into him before, and so that is kind of interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. And looking at Luke's account, Luke 23:51. It makes the point there that he had not consented to the decision. So he was one who had objected to what they did to Jesus. So just kind of keep that in mind. And of course, in our text, it talks about being a secret disciple for fear of the Jews, which we could, that's a discussion within itself. But
I forgot about what Luke said, Tom, that you brought up there. He had not consented to their decision and deed. He was from Arimathea, and who himself was also waiting for the kingdom of God. Luke goes on to write.
Right, yeah, and I wonder how many more there were like that. Remember we talked about that. What it was? I'm trying to remember. I think it's chapter 12. In John chapter 11 or 12, where many believed in him, but for fear of the Jews, they did not confess him. Lest they be cast out of the synagogue. Let me see. John 12:42. They did not confess him lest they be cast out of the synagogue. I don't know if Joseph was in that group right there. And what I find interesting about Joseph, and this is true with Nicodemus also. Nicodemus was also somewhat of a secret disciple. Under the way that we read about him, same thing. John 3, he came by night, and I think it points to the fact secretly he came. So how many others there were amongst? They weren't the majority, obviously, but there was a handful that were loyal to that believed in Jesus, but they were not, for lack of a better term, strong enough to take the stand that they needed to for Jesus. But the point I want you to understand is this was a remarkable week. Everything about this week was intense. And what I see in both Joseph and Nicodemus is when they did what they did, the council did what they did. That's what I would describe it as the straw that broke the camel's back. And once and for all, Joseph said, that's it. I'm done. And he stands up for Jesus, and he gives him honor in the way that he buries him or requests to bury him. If I understand, I believe it's his tomb. It's his tomb where he puts the body of Jesus, and that within itself shows the respect that he has.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on that? I want to throw something out there. Well, go ahead, Caleb, and then we'll throw something.
Isaiah 53 and verse 9, we kind of mentioned it, but we didn't read it. But if you go read it, it says his grave was assigned with the wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had not done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Just casually 1,000 years beforehand, Isaiah writes about where he's going to be buried. I mean, it is one of those amazing things that you read. It's like, well, yeah, that happened.
Right. Yeah. There's when you look at all those accounts of prophecies, there's just details there. There's just those little details that make them such strong and powerful prophecies. And the only thing that a skeptic or a critic can do with this is to basically say that people that were familiar with the old law put Jesus into what the old law said. In other words, they wrote the story and they made sure that they added the things that were prophesied so that they could boost to their case. And of course, this is those who advocate that they were frauds. That they knew that he hadn't really been resurrected and so on, which is the argument, or they were delusional and they were so desperate to prove that Jesus was the Messiah that they wrote Jewish prophecy into who he was. So,
or when it was written, that's which makes the Dead Sea Scrolls so much more important. When you start looking at those, like, why are they so important? Because it proves it was written before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and by the way, that's why they have to do that to deny the resurrection. You cannot deny the prophecies that were there before. You cannot deny them. That's just like Isaiah, the book of Isaiah itself. Skeptics of the Bible will say that there had to be two Isaiahs, or Isaiah was actually written during the period of silence because of some of the things that Isaiah talks about. So that's the only answer. They can't accept it at face value because it would indict their denials.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'll add one more thought. I know I actually said this a couple of weeks ago, and I'll say it again. One of the things I always catch out of this is that when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus go do this, they're being so bold about their discipleship with Jesus. By handling the body, they become unclean. They can't have the Passover. That they do this in a way that both declares to the Romans and to the Jews we're disciples of Jesus. It's something that Jesus' own apostles couldn't do it. I can't help but to feel like, why do they name Joseph of Arimathea in all four accounts? Well, maybe we're supposed to say, wow, that guy's a superstar. There's a guy that, at the end, whenever it looked like everything was lost, he's still Jesus' disciple. He's still going to follow Jesus, even if, no matter what it is. And I think I did a sermon on it once to say, wow, what a superstar, because, he gave up in that moment. He is throwing everything out the window. His own people just killed Jesus. What do you think is going to happen to him at the next meeting? Well, I don't think he's going to be there very long. I don't think he's going to last as a council member. Maybe, like I said, if you're following somebody that the Romans just executed, maybe you're going to be executed. I mean, there's so much variable here that the night Jesus dies, we have to consider it's a whole different story. I mean, we know what's going to happen next. But from Joseph of Arimathea's point, all he's doing is he is showing this tender compassion to the physical body of Jesus. Yeah. And I just, like I said, I really think I think Joseph is much more of a superstar than we give him acknowledged, because we just kind of read past it. I think he is really an extraordinary disciple, because he's being a disciple without reward here. He's being a disciple with no value. And Nicodemus too, 100 pounds of stuff. I mean, think about that, 100 pounds of these things. Where did he go get that night? Well, I don't think he could have gotten it that night. So maybe he already had it. Maybe this was, I'm going to die soon, but instead of me, we're going to put this on the body of that criminal that the Romans just killed. He wouldn't have said that, but that would be the perspective of everybody else. So I just really think this is a really profound image and event, what these two men are doing.
Well, you think about it, like Judas had a role to play. He still held accountability before it, but he had a role to play. And Joseph of Arimathea, maybe this was his role, to do what he did, because it wasn't happenstance. It was in fulfillment of prophecy, effectively. But have you ever considered the difference between Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, and the men who were chosen to be the 12? You think about Matthew, who is a tax collector. Peter, James, and John were all fishermen, I believe. You have, of course, Judas Iscariot and Simon the Zelotes, the zealot. All of them, of course, had different backgrounds. But of, let's say, 14 men, so I'm talking about the 12, and then Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, just for the sake of argument. Joseph of Arimathea, just call him Joseph for short, maybe J. Him and Nicodemus, their life was centered probably around the council. They were a part of that. And their life was heaped in Old Testament teaching, the law of Moses. And it probably took more for them to, not more, it was probably more important to them, or more necessary is the right word I'm looking for, to truly consider everything that they were hearing and seeing from Jesus. The apostles could accept him. He says, here, come follow me, I'll make you fishers of men, and they go. But the knowledge of the old law may have served a little bit as an anchor to keep these two individuals where they were until maybe the right time they had a greater understanding of who Jesus was in fulfillment of prophecy. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe not.
Yeah, you know what, John? Also, they were understand that they were on the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
As far as loyalty to Jesus. And let's and I just now thought about this, or at least came back to my mind. Where do the Gospels get the concept of how Jesus was convicted and so on? The various trials and everything that went through, the things that were said by the council trying to get rid of Jesus, trying to get rid of Lazarus, and other things like that. I honestly suspect that the fact of Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, they would have been witnesses that would have contributed to the gospel accounts. Why is John writing the details about Nicodemus? And by the way, John is the only gospel that talks about Nicodemus. Joseph is mentioned in all four.
Okay.
But John and John, and I kind of looked this up. Nicodemus is actually mentioned in three different accounts. You have one in the middle. You have one in the middle of the ministry of Jesus in John 7, where he's basically trying to defend Jesus to the council, and he gets shut down.
You one of his disciples too.
Yeah. Are you one of exactly? He gets shut down as he's trying to do that. But the point is we know what happened in the council because Joseph and Nicodemus were there. So that's a part of God's plan, giving us the details.
We have to think about that. I realize the default answer is, well, the Holy Spirit told them. And I have no problems with the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But they would have had to have heard it from other people, like Mark. Yeah. Who did Mark learn this from? Well, Peter wasn't there all the way through the trial process, was he? I mean, after he denied Jesus, he ran off. Brian, I think maybe you made this point a couple weeks ago. And so he wouldn't have been there. John, like you said, Tom. And so the source information that Luke pulled on, who were the eyewitnesses that he talked to? It's a good point about these two individuals here.
Right, and sometimes, getting into the apologetics discussions on these types of things, on the gospel accounts and so on, you hear about how Mark was the primary source. The argument that is basically made is Mark was the earliest gospel. I think we talked about this. Matthew and Luke drew from Mark, but they also drew from another source that they described as Q. Basically it supposedly was just sayings of Jesus. We know nothing about Q, from that standpoint. And the point that I'm making in that is that's a possibility. It doesn't take away from the inspiration of Scripture. The fact that they had in front of them a gospel account, but they didn't copy it word for word. They added details. They would have talked to other witnesses, and that's how you get the three synoptics, working together, and they don't contradict each other. So yes, there may have been another source that Matthew and Luke drew from. That doesn't take away from the inspiration. Now, those that are making the argument or invented that argument, they may be thinking that, but the point is it doesn't dismiss the reality of the Gospels, because we have all these details, and we can put things together as we deal with them. And there's some great apologists out there that tie these things together. There's one of my favorite ones now. If I mention his name, I know he's denominational, but J. Warner Wallace. He was a cold case detective in Los Angeles, and he actually put his cold case detective skills and remember what a cold case is. A cold case is a case that took place a long time ago. Witnesses may be dead, and all those types of things, but yet you can study the details and you can reach a conclusion, a good conclusion circumstantially as to what happened. And he applied that and went from being an atheist to a believer in Jesus. And that's what his book is called, Cold Case Christianity. That's what his book is about. And since then, he's written others. God's Crime Scene, which is a book that deals with creation, the creation of the world, and those types of books. And so you put all the facts together, and you have a better understanding, and you have a reason to believe the events that are recorded in the Gospels were real, and you can answer the critics. And in fact, I have another point about that when we get down to verse 41. I want to make an observation about that.
Okay, all right. Any other thoughts about verse 39 and 40? That's a lot of myrrh and aloe, 100 pounds.
Yeah, right. And by the
Yeah.
way, I was thinking about this. Understand, Joseph and Nicodemus, what they're doing, I believe they're not expecting Jesus to arise. Just keep that in mind. I mean, of course, that was true of the apostles too. We know nobody believed he was going to come back. It's kind of ironic. The only ones that listened to Jesus saying, "In 3 days I'm going to arise," were the Pharisees, the corrupt council that go to Pilate in Matthew's gospel and ask for the body. They're the only ones that acknowledge his claim. In 3 days I'm going to be raised. Guard the tomb, until the 3 days are over, so his disciples don't come and steal the body. That's so. Bear that in mind. Joseph and Nicodemus, they think Jesus is dead and he's gone, and what they're doing is an attempt to honor Jesus because they believe that he was wrongly treated, or know that he was wrongly treated.
We'll get to this here in a little bit later, but it's interesting that in verse 9 of chapter 20, for as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Then the disciples went away again to their own homes. It's interesting. Yeah. Who was about to speak? John, I spoke up. Mm-hmm.
Didn't you just preach a lesson on the 9 times Jesus talked about his being raised from the dead? I mean,
yeah, nine times, and I think in almost every instant, well, not quite every instance, but of the synoptic gospels, I think in every instance he says, "Rise again" or "Rise the third day." Yeah.
Over and over. They didn't get it because they didn't want to get it. And of course we need to be careful being critical of them. We can sit there and say, well, if I was there, I wouldn't have been like that. More than likely you would have.
We can Monday morning quarterback it all we want, but
exactly. And so be careful. I've even heard this about Thomas. Thomas has the moniker Doubting Thomas. He didn't doubt as much as you think when you read some other things about him. He wasn't as big of a doubter as we make him out to be from that stand. And I'm not saying he didn't have some doubts, but the point is, the point about all of them, we would, more than likely, we would have been just like the rest of them.
I think, let me throw my 2 cents in there, because I think we're saying something important. If I pulled Jesus's body down from the cross and it's bloody and it's butchered and it's marred, he is as dead as I've ever seen a person dead. I don't think there's any way my mind could ever say, well, I'll see him in 3 days. I don't think it would be possible for me to reconcile what I was looking at, that Jesus was going to come back. I think that there's just sometimes where you're overwhelmed with the fact of it. It's one of the reasons why when you go to a funeral, we talk about closure. You see the body of the person who's died, and something happens in your mind. Your mind it kind of locks into the idea that this person is now gone, that this person is left. And that's why funerals are kind of important for us, to see that person deceased, to see their body put away. There's a change that occurs in your psyche. And I think we just have to appreciate that as these 2 men are pulling Jesus's body down, and as every, maybe all the apostles, we know John saw it, but maybe all of them saw Jesus's dead body. Thomas talks about it. There's just something in your psyche that says, well, he is dead. There's no coming back from this, because, and like I said, it's the brain. It's 10,000 a year, 10,000 experiences of death that make that when you see that dead body, that they're completely gone.
Right. And I just thought of something when you said that, Brian. You go and see somebody that dies a natural death and they're all fixed up, laying there in the casket and so on. That's totally different from somebody that was executed. Back then, we've heard of the instances of people that you thought they were dead and then come back to life. That doesn't happen with people that are executed, and understand that uh, the crucifixion would have been a description of cruel and unusual punishment. Something that we're not supposed to do when if a state executes somebody, they do it as quickly and humanely as possible. That didn't happen to Jesus. They knew Jesus was dead, and like Brian said, that body was mutilated. In a lot of ways, and it would have been a terrible picture, and it was verified. He's dead. Spear thrust in the side, blood and water separated, comes forth, verifying he had been dead for some time, and so on and so forth.
Okay. We've got a comment I'll bring up here real quick. I'm trying to remember a Bible verse, and my searches is failing me. Anyway, when he was, and this will get to the point where we're talking about, when he was hanging on the cross, they said he raised others. Let's see if he can raise himself. That's a paraphrase if I'm remembering it right. And that was the problem. The apostles had seen Jesus raise other people. But now the one who was the raiser of the dead himself was dead, as you already have so well pointed out. David Clark, he chimes in, and it's a good question. First off, why, and I'm assuming he's talking about why was 100 pounds of myrrh and aloe needed? It's a good question, David. I've never prepared someone for burial, but that's what they had. That's a good point. Good question. The second thing is, what is synoptic gospels? Basically, it's a fancy term people use in reference to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason why they're called synoptic is because they all share similar view or perspective of the life of Christ. There's a lot of similarities, a lot of overlaps between those three gospels, whereas John kind of stands apart in the way that John records the events within the life of Jesus there. So anytime someone says synoptic, they're talking about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So
Matthew, Mark, and Luke basically carry the same storyline.
Yeah.
Except they plug in different details, and they're addressed to different audiences. Like you said, John, we've pointed this out before. John is about 95% unique. The material that is in John. That's how different John is, and that's why we sometimes describe John as a supplemental gospel. It was written later, and he had a specific purpose in mind, but that goes back to the point I made earlier. I think John had a copy of at least one, if not more, of the other gospels in front of him as he put together the Gospel of John. He was familiar with those other Gospels. So that's that. Now, why so much spice? Well, the decomposing bodies stink.
Well, and the tomb is going to be open for 3 days.
Yeah, and that's the reason. It's packing a body. Packing a big body, you're not going to do it with 1 pound of something. So that's what they typically did, and I don't know what all the spices did. I'm sure different spices had different functions, but some of them had to probably do with odor. They probably had to do with either enhancing the decomposition process or slowing or whatever. But it was what they typically did to a body.
Yeah. Well, it does 3 things. Right? It slows the decomposition, it masks the odor, and it shows honor and respect.
Yeah.
But this is an exorbitant amount because it's a burial fit for a king. And I think that's the important thing to remember is he's going to be
That's a good point.
buried as a king, it says in Isaiah 53.
Yeah.
Brand new tomb, hewn out of a rock. I mean, it's an expensive burial place. It's an expensive burial process. But Jesus is worthy of that.
That's a good point.
And Joseph viewed him as so
Nice.
worthy that he gave him his own tomb.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, Joseph didn't realize he was loaning it to him.
And typically when they do that, it's a family tomb. So you
Yeah.
think about that. You know, this is where the whole family's going to be buried, and now we're just
Yeah.
going to give it all away.
So guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but the process in those ancient times is that you would put the body in the tomb, it would decay. Then a couple of years later, you would go in and you would collect all the bones and you would put them in an ossuary and take that somewhere else. And then you would use that tomb again for the next person that died. Is that correct?
Yeah,
That's what
I believe it was
I've read,
1
yeah.
year. It could
1
be
year?
more,
Okay.
but I think it was 1 year.
So one thing might be,
which
Oh,
means
go ahead.
you'd want to enhance you'd
That's
want
right,
the
yeah.
process to happen in a specified period of time.
which is probably what a lot of these herbs and stuff are doing. And it's interesting that they put 100 pounds of him now. And then 2 days later, Mary and Martha, or the multiple Marys and Jesus'
They wanna
mother and all
finish.
these women, they're going to go back and put more on him. So it's interesting that that's it. And Tom, I think you're right. I think it was probably that a lot of what this did was, we talk about mummification, but this might have been can I say putrefaction, just something that enhances the decomposition process to make it, quicker, so that, as I said, at the end of time. So one, on a side note, one of those really neat little tidbits that we have is that years ago they found Caiaphas's ossuary box that archaeologists were digging, and they hit a hole and looked in, and there's a bone box, and it says Caiaphas, who's the high priest that put Jesus to this. They actually have found Caiaphas's body. I think that's a real remarkable thing to think about.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Basically, that's how you got more use out of a grave or a tomb. Think about the cave of Machpelah with Abraham. Of course, that would have been, a couple thousand years earlier. But you could get more aunts and uncles in there by putting their bones in ossuary, which is an interesting and completely unrelated subject question about the Judgment Day. Had someone ask me, what about cremation? And we were kind of discussing it. And I got started thinking, what about those people that's been in the tomb for, 1,000 years, and all their body, nearly their bones have probably decayed. And what about those in ossuary boxes when the Lord comes again? They've got that, the metal stone lid on top of them, and all their bones are just laying, piled up there. And I'm being a little bit facetious, but the point is that no type of death is going to limit you from when the Lord comes again, the resurrection. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll let God work that one out.
Yeah. What I was trying to say a while ago is they ridiculed Jesus. He saved others. Let him save himself, for he is the Christ, the chosen one. Right. So even his apostles saw him save others, but yet he was dead. And I could see them, like what y'all were talking about. Because you would have thought Peter would have been the first one back at the tomb. Okay, let's see. He said he's going to be raised again in 3 days. But no, I think they fully believed, at least up until that point. All right, any questions? Believe that he was dead. Yeah. All righty.
That's a powerful point. I think I mentioned it last week. In making the case for the resurrection, the first thing you got to establish is he was dead.
Yeah.
And secondly, it was Jesus. I mean, those are two cases you have to make. And the reason I say is critics. Critics will say somebody else died. I think some Muslims teach that somebody died in his place, and those types of things. So you've got to establish, number one, it was Jesus, and number two, that he was literally dead.
Yeah.
Period. Completely dead.
They didn't give him.
If you want to say it's somebody else, his mom is standing there. So we're just
Yep,
ignoring the eyewitness accounts, right?
there,
I mean,
there's some arguments, and logically, it's a flawed argument, very
yeah.
flawed. Matter of fact,
Well,
that's one of the things
unless
I want to talk about in verse 41.
all right, unless when some might say that when Joseph and came to take the body, they gave him the wrong body, like they gave him the body of the thief, or they gave him the body of Caleb, the other thief. Well, I don't know his name, Caleb.
Right.
But the point is, Joseph of Arimathea would not have accepted the wrong body.
Right. Yeah. Right.
You know, he accepted the body of Jesus. I mean,
Yeah, he knew which one it was.
yeah. All right, Tom, what did you want to cover about verse 41?
Yeah. Oh, okay. And since we're talking apologetics, this is so important here. In the place where he was crucified, and pull up Mark 15:47.
Mark
And what
15?
you have here, Mark 15:47.
Okay.
And it says there the place where he was crucified was in a garden, in a new tomb and stuff like that, where he had not been laid yet. Joseph knew where it was. In verse 42 or 47, it says
42.
Of Mark, where you were at.
Okay.
Mark 15:47.
Gotcha.
It says Mary Magdalene and Mary, mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid. One of the arguments that has been made is they went to the wrong tomb. Some say somebody else was buried, which, by the way, saying somebody else was buried in the tomb, that doesn't change the fact of Jesus was dead. I mean, you've got a dead body that was called Jesus on the cross. But another argument is made, they went to the wrong tomb and they discovered an empty tomb because they were upset and they weren't really thinking when they buried him, and it was done in such a hurry that they didn't remember which tomb. Well, number one, in John, it says it was Joseph's tomb. You think Joseph knew where his tomb was? And all the other three Gospels, and I looked them up, say basically something similar to what you have there in Mark 15 and verse number 47, where it makes the point that they observed where the body was laid. So the Gospels answer the arguments that skeptics are making 2,000 years later. And I just think that's a great point to drive home. Every argument that has been made to refute the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, there are little clues in the Gospels that refute
almost as though they were put there because they knew what people were going to say.
Almost like there was a divine being that was behind what was being written and making sure that what was written was there. Yeah. I'd call him God.
And then about the time we get really critical on text criticism and start saying, I don't think it was written when it was, and we trip over that time capsule called the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, it
almost as though there's some greater power that's every time somebody gets smarty, they get their pants pulled over their head.
Yep.
Yeah.
On a side note, did y'all see that thing, and I haven't looked at it in great detail, where they think some of the Dead Sea Scrolls may be older than what they were thinking?
Yes, I did. That was very interesting. Yeah, that was very interesting. Of course, the article I read was like, the writer clearly still didn't believe, the real author of Daniel lived in the 4th century. So now we know it probably was, about the time of the real author. Oh, come on, you knucklehead.
Yeah.
You just can't admit it. You just, it's just beyond your ability to acknowledge, We have a picture of Daniel. We think it's something else.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts before we move into chapter 20?
What I think is interesting in verse 21 when he says it's a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid.
Yeah.
And why that's so significant. And I always think about this when we go back and look at Kings. You think about 2 Kings 13, 20 and 21. When Elisha died. This is just so random of a story. But it's so interesting that it applies to Jesus' death because the bands from Moab invaded the land in the spring of the year. So it was as they were burying a man, suddenly they spied a band of raiders and they put the man in the tomb of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood on his feet.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Elisha the prophet, his bones still speak, still has power. God's power didn't leave him. And that could be, maybe an argument. You read that, well, maybe, Jesus touched some prophet's bones or something, and that's how he's coming back. But that one line, refutes that. Brand new
Yeah.
tomb, nobody else had been laid there.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
I
argument's
think
out the window.
I actually like to point out, Caleb, I like to make the statement about Elisha and what happened there and compare it to when Jesus arose, all the other saints that arose with him, that it was when Elisha was dead, one person came back to life. But when Jesus restored, it was so profound that lots of people came back to life. That it was, and
Yeah.
I kind of say, there's so many parallels with Jesus and Elijah and Elisha. And, I like to say, wow, here's this, moment where when Elisha dies, somebody falls in his body and comes back to life. When Jesus dies and when Jesus dies, the tombs break apart. I should be careful to say it wasn't when he was resurrected they came to life. They came to life when he died. And so I think it's a
Yeah.
parallel to what happened with Elisha. One guy came back to life when Elisha was dead, but lots of people came back to life when Jesus died. It was such a profound event.
Yeah.
Well, I see that a little bit differently, Brian.
No, you can't. You're not allowed.
Let me go back to that text. I always read that as that they came forward, they came out of the graves after his resurrection.
I don't think so. I think it's when he died, it says, and the veil is torn. That's Matthew. You got to go to Matthew's account.
Matthew
Yeah, it is Matthew.
27.
Yeah, it is Matthew, and it's
Is it 27, 28?
It'd be 20,
54. It's 27.
27.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it 53?
All right, so
verse 52 and 53.
So here's how I kind of read that. Let me bring up the Bible real quick. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised, and coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went to the holy city and appeared to many. So
So what I took that, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
I took it though that they came into the city after his resurrection. Because the events in 51 are when he's dying. And I assume the event in 52 is when he died too, that the grave is open, the earth is quaking and the graves are open and the bodies of saints are raised and they came out of their graves. And then it says after his resurrection, they went in the holy city. I admit that's kind of that I can see where you could make two different
coming out of the graves after his resurrection. Of course, it's the New King James.
Are they raised in the graves?
Yeah, do they just sit there? Let me 3 days.
And just remember in all of this, if you look at a Greek manuscript from that time, it was all capital letters. There was no spaces between words, and there was no punctuation. So we put punctuation where we think it belongs, and I think we get it right most of the time.
Yeah. The ESV says in coming out of the tombs after his resurrection. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to belabor that point.
and what that tells us is if whenever they were raised, I mean, the tombs were clearly opened when the earthquake happened.
Yeah.
And
did they lie there for 2 or 3 days?
The veil of the temple torn in two. And it says, and many of the bodies of saints had fallen asleep were raised. And I guess I don't have time to look up and figure out the Greek that's attached behind. That is the tense of the words, which would be an interesting study within itself. But
yeah, it really now explains something. I mentioned this some years ago in another study, and they seemed a little bit surprised that I said that, and I kind of see why now. Rotherham's enhanced, emphasized Bible, he says, And the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the holy ones who had fallen asleep arose, and coming forth out of the tombs after his arising, entered into the holy city and plainly appeared unto many. Either
and that's
way,
kind of interesting because that
yeah,
tells us that they stayed alive for a few days at least.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the question is, was this the zombie apocalypse?
It wouldn't have felt good if I
what
was
they look
the,
like?
you know,
You know,
Yeah.
what
if I
did
was the
these
guy in charge
bodies?
of the graveyard.
Yeah. What did these bodies look like? Were they freshly dead people? You know, were they decayed? How long had they been dead, et cetera, et cetera? We're not told. But it was making a point that got the attention
Yeah.
of people.
Yeah.
I think, like I said, when I look at that story, I do think of exactly what Caleb was talking about earlier. I think of the death of Elisha. I think
That's a good point.
my feeling is that it's meant to be kind of a, something, so Elisha and Elijah, raised three people from the dead. Jesus raised three people from the dead. I kind of point that out, but that's the third one is the guy that fell in the tomb and died and came back to life. But I just think it's, profound that, you have this, third person, all these people that are raised with Jesus. And like I said, I don't think it really, if it's whether he died or when he was resurrected, it's still this profound image that Jesus is so profound. It's kind of like some great thing coming up out of the ocean. It just drags everything with, when Jesus arises from the grave, it's so profound that others came out too, just maybe the proximity of his grave, maybe just being nearby him. But like I said, I think it was probably when he died that the tombs open and the dead come to life, but they don't come into the city, and what does that mean? They just sit around, well, this is different, I don't know. I mean, it's, you guys are right. Well, it's a perplexing statement, but
I wouldn't think their resurrection would preempt his as far as in appearance.
Yeah.
But
otherwise, it's just Jesus is one of many people that resurrect. In other words, and of course, like I said, I want to be careful. Jesus resurrected. They're raised from the dead. There is a difference, because every one of those people dies again. But Jesus is in the resurrected form that doesn't die again. It's not mortal anymore. So it is different. But I think the reason that they hold back in coming into the city is that it's understandably, you don't want anybody else to be first. You want the first person that you hear about to be Jesus of Nazareth. And, that's the story you need to get in there, that this happens. So it's a perplexing account. Like I said, that little tidbit, Mark, it makes me scratch my head a lot. But as I said, I think it's what Caleb brought up. I think it's meant to parallel that. And I think we're supposed to, see that even the dead held back till Jesus was out, Jesus had been announced and they came up, showing up.
Yeah. Shows the power of Christ and the power of God. I mean, think about Lazarus' resurrection 4 days after he died. So the Lord could restore the body of whoever he chose to when the rocks were open and the bodies came forth. Whether they were in ossuaries or not, fully restored. All right. And I think that's a good point, Brian. The fact that Jesus was the only one never to die again. There's nothing in the text to indicate that they had that same it wasn't that same resurrection. All right. Any other thoughts?
David just asked a question that said, maybe it was just their souls that arose. What I'd say to that is, it would only be significant if it was their physical bodies. I mean, if you're talking a soul, that's the best explanation you could get out of that would be the similarity to a ghost. And again, that's not being raised.
What the people saw were bodies. They saw
exactly.
people.
And God was getting their attention. I wish we had more details about that, but we don't. I mean, literally, this is all that is said about it. Is what you read there in the gospel about the bodies.
The one detail I always come back to is that Paul mentions that these things weren't done in a corner. Everybody knows what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, God wanted it known that you all have done something. And a whole nother point, since I know we're running out of time, and obviously the resurrection will be next week, or in 2 weeks, whatever.
You heard it from Tom. The resurrection will
Yeah.
be next week. He's named the day. That's a
Yeah.
prediction. Tom at
Because
truthfactor.com.
I need to write this down.
I won't be here. So.
And wait a second. If Tom's not here, is it possible he got raised and we got left behind? No.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what was I talking about? No. You know, dealing with all these things that are associated with the burial. They're just.
You were pointing out that we are out of time and don't have enough time to get into the resurrection.
And oh, I know what I was going to say is it's mentioned that the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. I think Matthew's account, mentions that. Several things significant happened with the death of Jesus. God was getting their attention in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
He wanted them to know, number one, you all were you were wrong. You were wrong. What you did was corrupt. Maybe that's another way of saying it. Maybe not use the term wrong, because they were wrong in their motives, but it had to happen. But you all were corrupt. You all are wicked individuals, and you have angered me again. And I'm showing you my anger. Dead bodies walking out of graves. The veil of the temple, and it says it was ripped from top to bottom. I don't think that's an accident. Typically with a rip, it's bottom to top. Top to bottom, from heaven down. And of course, I've heard the discussion, and we don't know, was the Ark of the Covenant actually there? There's debate as to whether or not they actually had possession of the Ark during the first century, which, again, it's irrelevant. But the point is the Holy of Holies was exposed. And we know that there's spiritual implication to that. See Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, as an example of that. But all of these things happen. God gets the attention of everybody in Jerusalem. Everybody.
The death of Jesus, the death of Jesus, it took that separation from God away.
Exactly. And that's the point. It was nailed to the cross. And a Roman soldier witnessing everything happen says, truly this was the Son of God, or a Son of God, I think, depending on the translation. But the point is, as a Roman soldier, he knew what Jesus was accused of. And would it have just been the fact that Jesus died early that would cause him to say that? Or were there spectacular things happening, like an unexplained darkness for 6 hours? And I don't want to hear people will say, oh, that was just an eclipse of the sun. Well, Paul's not here. I was going to ask Paul, how long does an eclipse last? And I mean, this darkness was for hours. And so you've got that taking place. God, again, a soldier, a Roman soldier, this was the Son of God. The thing that he was being accused of, obviously he was somebody. And God's declaring what's happening.
Okay.
With the death and the burial of Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah, but guys, this is exciting stuff, right? I think, when Jesus is dying, the world is breaking apart. And Tom, you brought up the thing I wanted to talk about was that Roman soldier who says, we just killed the Son of God. Nothing convicts him of that except what Jesus is saying and what's happening in the world. And Tom, the thing I think that's heavy hitting is, so we had a full eclipse about 6-7 years ago, and it was a spiritually moving moment. And I know it's silly, but because the darkness was palpable. You could just kind of feel it. It was so unnerving, and all the animals are going crazy. But of course, you asked Tom, how long did it last? It lasted just a couple of minutes. But I remember thinking, wow, this is profound. I didn't expect it to be, kind of like I said, you're like, it's getting hard to breathe because the darkness was just coming over. And I say full, it was 99%. So it wasn't. So, a true, genuine full eclipse, but for 3 hours. There was a movie about the life of Jesus. One of the first ones. It was a silent movie, and in the movie, in this moment, Jesus dies, and the earth is shaking, the rocks are exploding, and I think it was cease to bleed the middle. He was lightning. And my mother said once, "Hey, Brian, you got to watch this scene." And I went back and watched it, and the high priest is there at the temple as the curtain is being torn, and and I really think they caught something because he just looks. I've done something terrible, and I just have to wonder. These priests are watching everything explode and fall apart, and maybe they're thinking of, hey, this happened to Mount Sinai once when God was talking, and it scared us to death then, and this is terrifying, and maybe the priests that know what's going on are thinking, maybe we made a big mistake. Maybe we did the wrong. You have to wonder, in Acts 5, a lot of the priests are going to be converted. You have to wonder if a lot of them are thinking right now, what if we were in the wrong on this? I mean, like I said, again, a Roman soldier's thinking that. So I just think all of this, this wasn't a very sterile moment where it was just Jesus dies silently. And I mean, this is a moment when the world is exploding. And you would be thinking, is the whole creation coming apart? Well, you just killed the creator of the universe. The light of the world has just been extinguished. So it's no doubt that's why the light in the world is gone at this moment. That there's a connection to that. And like I said, I love you guys talking about this because it gets me excited. I mean, this is just one of those things that I just think, wow, can you imagine in that moment, your whole world is exploding physically and literally as Jesus dies. Wow.
It's like the day of the Lord was now upon them. And that's a good comparison to Mount Sinai.
Right, yeah. Right.
That's a good point. I was wondering earlier if you could view it as like the true triumphal entry of Jesus, like a king coming in. But this was his death.
Yeah.
His introduction as king, that'll come on the day of Pentecost, basically. But this was more like the day of the Lord is coming. And that's a good point, Brian. What would they have thought? What were they thinking when it all happened?
Yeah, this
not
was
just
not
an
a
earthquake.
normal. Yeah, this wasn't normal. And incidentally, just mention this as we wrap up because we are out of time. These details that we're talking about, they're recorded in Matthew's gospel.
Yes.
And just remember, Matthew was written to the Jews. This is about Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And those who are familiar with Jerusalem.
They would have fully understood the implications of the veil of the temple being rent, whereas the Gentiles reading this many years later might not fully appreciate that.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't as significant to the Gentiles as it would have been to the Jews.
That's a good point. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts on that? All right. You know what? We only covered not quite 10 verses. But we did make it to the end of the chapter. Yeah. We
covered the burial.
We did. That's right. All right, let's plan next Thursday. Of course, Tom won't be here, I think, is what you said. Brian, how about you and Caleb?
Yeah. Now, just remember, next Thursday, as we point, it is the 3rd, so the day before July the 4th. So I don't know what that's going to do with your audience.
I'm trying not to be smart.
Is that a preacher holiday? We usually have like the day before and the day after.
All I know is I'm traveling, so.
Preachers get days off? What?
Yeah, that's right. So, Tom, you're going to see my co-preacher there, Ramon Castillo. So be sure to say hi to Ramon. Yeah, so he'll be there. He's the guy that works with me now. So this is his first experience to be in a place like that. So, Tom, you got to treat him good. Tom, you got to treat him good.
Talk to him.
Yeah, don't ask him for details.
Well, Brian and Caleb, will y'all be here next week?
I will be, yeah.
Okay.
I don't have anything interesting.
It's a normal day for me, too. Okay. All right. Well,
they don't invite me to preacher things. Tom gets invited, but I don't.
Tom's mind is still pliable. He can still be influenced and shaped a little bit. So
mine is calcified.
Tom, that's intended as a compliment, I think. I'm not sure.
Well,
yeah. I'll assume that.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for our study today. We will continue this next Thursday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time, Lord willing, picking up John chapter 20, verse 1, looking at the now empty tomb, the resurrection of Jesus. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you do have any thoughts or comments, please be sure to send them to questions@truthfactor.com or email us individually. You can do that as well if you would like to do so. All right, we'll see everyone next Thursday right here at truthfactor.com or Truth Factor Live on Facebook and YouTube. Y'all have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.